My name is Clara Mitchell. I am 34 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that family meant love, support, and sacrifice. I worked hard, kept my head down, and thought that one day my parents would finally see me for who I was. But instead, on the night they gathered us all around the old dining table, I was told that unless I paid $50,000 for my younger sister's wedding, I would no longer be their daughter. In that moment, every memory of loyalty and years of quiet sacrifice turned into a single question that I could not ignore. How far would you go when the people you trust most decide your worth is measured in dollars? Stay with me, because what unfolded after that dinner will leave you questioning what family truly means. Let me take you back to where it began. I still remember the way my father cleared his throat that evening, the sound sharp and deliberate in the quiet living room of the house where I grew up in Portland. The whole family had been summoned for what they said was an important talk before Rachel's wedding. I had driven over after work tired, but willing, thinking it might be about schedules or who was responsible for flowers or seating charts. Instead, I found myself sitting at the end of the long oak dining table, a place that made me feel like an outsider from the very start. My father Thomas sat at the head in his usual chair posture, straight, as if he were still a bank manager giving orders. My mother Linda hovered next to him, wringing her hands like she always did when she wanted to appear sympathetic but was ready to back him up. Rachel sat close by, glowing in the soft light with her fiancé Ethan at her side. They looked like a portrait staged for sympathy, her hands folded neatly on the table, his eyes glued to the carpet, as if the patterns there were more interesting than the conversation about to unfold. I smoothed the edge of my work blazer, wondering why I had been placed all the way at the other end. The air felt heavy, thick with expectation, as though everyone else already knew the script, and I was the only one who had not been given a copy. Thomas leaned back, pressing his palms together. "We all know Rachel is getting married in a few months," he said, his voice deep and rehearsed. "This is a milestone for our family. A wedding is not just a celebration, it is a statement of who we are." I nodded politely, waiting, though something in my stomach twisted. My mother gave Rachel a soft smile, then looked toward me with an expression that felt almost apologetic. "We have gone over the numbers," Thomas continued, "and the total cost will come to $50,000. He paused to let the weight of that number settle in the room. "Your mother and I believe that as a family we need to step up. And Clara, since you are in the best position, we expect you to handle the main share." For a moment, I thought I had misheard. My fork, which I had been rolling absent-mindedly across the tablecloth, slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. Ethan shifted in his chair but kept his eyes lowered. "Dad," I started, my voice uneven. "What do you mean by the main share?" He fixed his eyes on me, sharp and unblinking. "I mean the bulk of it. We know you have your accounting practice, steady clients, no husband, no children to support. You can manage this better than anyone." Rachel's eyes welled up on cue. She whispered, "I just want a proper wedding, Clara. I don't want to be embarrassed in front of our friends and relatives." Ethan reached over and patted her hand but said nothing, his jaw tight. My chest tightened with anger, but I forced a calm tone. "I have never agreed to pay for Rachel's wedding." Linda leaned forward, her voice coated in sugar. "Sweetheart, you are single, you have no burdens. Rachel has 2 children and so many responsibilities. This is what families do. We lift each other up." I looked at Rachel, then at my parents, and the silence stretched across the table like a rope pulled taut. Everyone waited for me to bend, to smile politely and say, "Of course I will write the check." Instead, I shook my head slowly. "That is not fair." My father's face darkened. "Fairness, Clara, is about sacrifice. If you cannot do this, then maybe you are not truly part of this family anymore." The words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was one thing to ask for help, another to make threats. Rachel dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling. "You have always had everything together. Perfect grades, perfect job. You don't understand what it's like to struggle. I just want this one day to be beautiful." I wanted to laugh at the performance, but the ache in my chest stopped me. I glanced at Ethan. His hands were shaking under the table, his knuckles white, but he refused to look at me. That silence spoke louder than anything. I gripped the edge of the table, steadying myself. My mind flashed back to years of working late nights, saving every dollar, dreaming of one day buying a modest condo where I could finally hang pictures on the wall without asking permission from a landlord. The number in my savings account had taken 5 years of 70-hour weeks, and now, without shame, they expected me to hand it over for a single night of flowers, food, and a rented ballroom. My father raised his chin, voice rising. "We have made our decision. You are the one who will take care of this. Everyone here is counting on you." The room held its breath. Rachel's children, Tyler and Emma, peeked in from the hallway, their wide eyes darting between their mother and me. They didn't understand the words, only the tension that made the air feel too heavy to breathe. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice steady. "I need time to think." "No," Thomas said, firmly pounding his hand once on the table. "There is nothing to think about. Either you help your sister, or you are no longer a daughter of this family." I sat frozen, staring at him, the man who had once taught me to ride a bike, who had drilled me on multiplication tables, who had said hard work would always be rewarded. Now those same eyes looked at me with cold calculation, as though I were nothing more than a bank account with a face. The silence was unbearable. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the wood floor. My mother gasped softly. Rachel clutched Ethan's arm, and my father glared at me as if daring me to defy him. I walked to the window, needing air, staring out at the dimming light of Portland's skyline. Behind me, the house that had always been my anchor felt suddenly like a cage. And in that moment, as my father's words still echoed in my ears, I knew the ground beneath our family had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. My mother was the first to break the silence. She leaned toward me with that practiced look of concern that I had seen all my life, the one that usually came before a lecture. "Clara," she said softly, "you know your father is right. You have always been independent. You have a steady job, you can spare it. Your sister cannot." Rachel sniffled beside her, pulling another tissue from her purse. Her eyes looked red, though I suspected it had more to do with performance than real tears. "Clara," she whispered, "I only want a proper wedding. I want it to be beautiful for my children to remember. I don't want people to think we are a failure." I pressed my hands flat on the table to keep them from shaking. "Rachel, you are 31 years old. If you and Ethan want a $50,000 wedding, then you and Ethan should be the ones to pay for it." Ethan finally looked up, his face pale. His lips parted as if he might say something, but Rachel grabbed his arm and shook her head quickly. He shut his mouth again and stared at the table. My father leaned forward, his jaw set. "Clara," he said in that commanding voice he used to use in the bank, "this is not a request. This is a responsibility. Families take care of one another." I felt heat rise in my chest. Families also respect each other. What you are asking is not help, it is a demand. Linda placed a hand on Thomas's arm as if to calm him, then turned her attention to me with a syrupy tone. "Sweetheart, you are single. You do not have children. You live comfortably, you travel sometimes. What is 50,000 to you compared to the security and dignity of your sister and her children?" I stared at her in disbelief. "Comfortably," I repeated. "I live in a rented apartment with a leaky window. I cook every meal at home to save. I work late nights during tax season, and I have been saving for years for a small condo of my own. That money is my future, not extra cash for a party." Rachel's tears spilled faster. "You don't understand what it's like, Clara. You don't know what it feels like to have children depending on you to try your hardest and still come up short." The room shifted toward her side instantly. My mother nodded with sympathy, my father frowned at me as if I were heartless, and even Ethan gave me a look of wounded pride. I was suddenly cast as the villain, the selfish career woman with no husband and no children who could not possibly understand real life. I clenched my jaw and tried to steady my voice. "I am not refusing to help because I don't care. I am refusing because what you are asking will wipe out everything I have worked for." Thomas slammed his palm on the table, making the glasses rattle. "Enough," he barked. You will help your sister, or you will not be part of this family." Rachel leaned against Ethan's shoulder, her voice barely audible. "She has always thought she was better than me." Perfect Clara, with her perfect numbers. I wanted to scream to remind everyone of the years I had sacrificed, the nights I had spent studying, while Rachel was out partying, the steady climb I had made, without anyone's handouts. Instead, I inhaled slowly, tasting the bitterness of the air. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and tense. "Maybe we should not push her. If Clara cannot do it, we will figure something out." Rachel snapped her head toward him, her eyes wide with fury. "You promised me we would have this wedding," she hissed. "You promised." Ethan swallowed hard and looked away again, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her glare. My mother turned back to me, her patience thinning. "Clara, think of your nephews. Do you want them to see their mother humiliated? Do you want them to think you care more about money than family?" The guilt pierced me like a knife. I pictured Tyler and Emma, innocent faces that did not deserve to be pawns in this. But then, I remembered Rachel's history, the failed businesses. The loans never repaid, the constant pleas for one more chance. I sat back in my chair and folded my arms tightly across my chest. "I cannot give you $50,000. Thomas's voice grew icy. "Then you are no daughter of mine." The words felt like a physical blow, but I forced myself not to flinch. My mother's lips trembled, her eyes wet, but there was no softness in her stare. Rachel looked triumphant through her tears, as if she had won something by pushing me to the edge. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze, his silence louder than any accusation. I looked at each of them, in turn my heart pounding but my face calm. If this is what you truly believe, then maybe I do not belong here after all. No one responded. The only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, each second hammering home the distance growing between us. I pushed back my chair, the legs scraping across the hardwood floor. My father's eyes followed me unyielding, while my mother dabbed at her cheeks. Rachel clutched Ethan's hand, whispering something I could not hear, and Ethan looked as though he wanted to vanish into the wall. I walked slowly toward the doorway, every step heavy, with the knowledge that the lines had been drawn, and for the first time in my life, I was standing on the outside of my own family. The drive back to my apartment that night felt endless. Streetlights blurred past my windshield, and all I could hear was my father's voice echoing in my head, saying I was no daughter of his. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. By the time I pulled into the cracked parking lot of my building, my whole body was trembling with a mix of anger and grief. Inside, I dropped my keys on the counter and sank onto the couch without even turning on the lights. The silence was heavy, and in it old memories rose to the surface like ghosts. I saw myself at 16 standing behind the register at a small grocery store in Portland, bagging groceries late into the night after school. I worked weekends at a diner too, pouring coffee for truckers and calculating tips to the penny. Every dollar went into a savings jar I kept hidden in my closet because I knew my parents would have told me to give it to Rachel if they found out. Rachel was in high school, then wrecking her second used car within months. My parents had shaken their heads but bought her a third one anyway, saying she was still learning. I had to buy my own first car at 18, with the money I had scraped together from 3 jobs, and I drove that rusty thing until it died on the highway outside Salem. Nobody bought me another one. I thought about college. I had gotten a partial scholarship to Oregon State, but it barely covered tuition. The rest I paid through loans and the money I earned working nights in the campus library. Rachel started at a private college in California, lasted 1 semester, and came home with a suitcase of clothes she had blown money on. My parents quietly wrote off the $15,000 they had paid for that failed attempt. It went on like that for years. Every time Rachel stumbled, there was a safety net. Every time I tried to stand on my own, I was told I was lucky. Lucky for the scholarships I earned. Lucky for the clients I built from scratch after I got my CPA license. Lucky that I did not need anyone's help. That word followed me like a curse. I pushed myself off the couch and walked to my small desk by the window. Inside the top drawer was a brown envelope I had not opened in months. I pulled it out and sat down, my fingers brushing against the seal. I opened it and unfolded the pages. Inside the ones I had insisted Rachel sign in March 2020. The promissory note was crisp and clear, notarized by a woman named Karen from a small office downtown. It stated that Rachel borrowed $30,000 from me to open her jewelry boutique, that she promised to repay it within 24 months with 5% interest. At the time, she had smiled and hugged me, promising this would be the start of her success. She had said she wanted to show our parents she could make something of herself. I had believed her. By June 2020, she had already started making excuses. First it was the pandemic, then Ethan's job loss, then the kids needing supplies for school. By Christmas that year, the boutique was closed, the rent unpaid, and Rachel was on to her next idea, talking about a food truck she wanted to start. I had asked about repayment and she had waved her hand, saying we were family and it would work itself out. It had not. 4 years later, she had not paid back a single cent, not even the interest. Every time I brought it up, she cried, told me I was cruel for asking, and then my mother would call me to remind me that Rachel had children, and I did not. I ran my fingers over the signature at the bottom of the contract. Clara Mitchell, written in her hurried, looping handwriting. For years I had kept this paper tucked away, unsure if I would ever use it, but now I felt a strange calm settle over me. My parents had accused me of never helping, had threatened to cut me off because I refused to pay for her wedding. Yet here was the truth, written and notarized, that I had already given more than they would ever acknowledge. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Images of the past returned in flashes. The Christmas morning when Rachel had unwrapped a new iPhone from my parents while I had gotten a sweater on sale. The Thanksgiving dinner where Rachel cried about bills while I sat quietly biting my tongue, knowing she owed me thousands. The 4th of July picnic when she bragged about her new Toyota Highlander the same summer she had told me she could not make her first payment on the loan. I felt the bitterness rise, but alongside it came something else: resolve. If my parents wanted to pretend that I had never done anything for Rachel, I would remind them. If they wanted to push me into a corner and make me look like the selfish one, I had proof that told a very different story. I folded the papers carefully and slid them back into the envelope. For the first time in years, I was glad I had been meticulous. My father had taught me when I was little to keep records of everything, to save receipts, to document deals. He had no idea that advice would one day be used against the daughter he favored. As I tucked the envelope back into the drawer, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Rachel. "I'm sorry things got heated tonight," she wrote, "but I know you'll come around. I'm counting on you." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. My thumb hovered over the reply button, but I set the phone down instead. There was nothing I could say that she would hear. The night stretched long and sleep would not come. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of years pressing down on me. By dawn, I knew one thing for certain. If they wanted to play this game, I was finally ready to show them the rules. By mid-morning, I was sitting at my desk in the office downtown, staring at the spreadsheets on my screen without really seeing them. Numbers usually calmed me, neat rows and columns that always added up the way they should. That day, they swam together until I pushed back my chair and reached for my phone. There was only one person I trusted enough to share this with. Rebecca answered on the second ring, her voice brisk and warm at the same time. "Clara," she said, "what's going on? You sound wrecked." I swallowed hard. "They want me to pay for Rachel's wedding," I told her. $50,000. And when I said no, Dad told me I was no longer his daughter. For a moment, she was silent. Then she let out a long, low whistle. "That's not just unreasonable, Clara. That's manipulation." I could feel my throat tighten. They made it sound like I was the selfish one, like I don't care about family. Even Rachel sat there crying, saying she only wanted her kids to see a proper wedding. Rebecca's voice sharpened. "You have already given more to that family than anyone else. Remember when Rachel came to me last year, begging for a $10,000 loan for some new business idea? I said no. She probably assumed I would never tell you, but I think you need to know. I sat up straighter in my chair, my heart pounding. She asked you too. She did, Rebecca confirmed. She came to my office like it was casual, saying it was just to tide her over until Ethan found steady work again. She wanted me to keep it between us. I told her absolutely not. Clara, this isn't just about a wedding. She has been making the rounds looking for anyone she can lean on. I pressed a hand to my forehead. That explains why Ethan looked like he wanted to disappear. Maybe he knows she's been doing this behind his back. Rebecca hesitated, then asked, "Do you still have that contract she signed for the $30,000? I do. I found it last night." "Good. Keep it safe," she said firmly. "And Clara, do not let them bully you. This is not about generosity. This is about control." Her words hit me like a truth I had always known, but never said aloud. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the traffic crawling down Burnside. For years I had bent over backward to prove I was a good daughter, a good sister, responsible, reliable. And now here, I was being threatened with exile from my own family because I refused to hand over my future. Rebecca's tone softened. "I know it hurts. I know you want their approval. But approval that comes with a price tag isn't real." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. "You're right," I whispered. "I just don't know how to face them now. Take it one step at a time. If they push again, you push back with facts. You have evidence, you have the truth, and you have me." Her steadiness calmed me, and for the first time since the fight at my parents' house, I felt like I wasn't standing alone in the storm. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a while, letting her words sink in. My phone buzzed again, a text from Rachel. It read, "I hope you're thinking about what I said. The kids will be so disappointed if their aunt won't help." I didn't respond. Instead, I slipped the phone into my drawer, pulled the contract envelope from my bag, and laid it flat on the desk. The gold notary seal caught the morning light, a reminder that no matter how much they twisted the story, I wasn't the villain. I touched the paper with my fingertips, then slid it back into the envelope. The day stretched ahead of me, long and uncertain, but my resolve was firming. They could guilt me, shame me, even disown me. What they couldn't do was erase the truth. The office door creaked as one of my junior associates stepped in with a file. I forced a smile, took it from her, and got back to work. On the surface, I looked calm, buried in tax forms and balance sheets. Inside, though, the battle lines were drawn, and I knew the real fight had only just begun. The messages started coming the very next morning. My phone buzzed before I had even poured my first cup of coffee. It was my mother writing in short clip sentences that carried more weight than paragraphs ever could. "We need to know when you will send the money. Rachel has to put down a deposit on the venue." I stared at the screen, the steam from my mug curling against my face, and felt that familiar knot tighten in my chest. By lunchtime, I had 5 missed calls from my father, 2 from Rachel, and a voicemail from Aunt Marlene telling me she had heard I was giving my sister a hard time. The rumor mill had clearly been working overtime. When I logged into Facebook to check a client message, Rachel's post popped up on my feed. "Some people are blessed with money, but cursed with selfish hearts," it read, followed by a photo of her children smiling in their school uniforms. The comments were already filling with relatives chiming in saying things like, "Stay strong, Rachel," or "Shame on those who don't help family." I didn't need to guess who she meant. My pulse quickened as I scrolled, feeling the hot sting of betrayal. She had painted me as the villain before I had even had a chance to breathe. I closed my laptop with more force than I meant to and paced the length of my apartment. The phone rang again. This time it was my cousin Melanie. I answered, hoping maybe she would want to hear my side. Instead, her voice was sharp. "Clara, is it true you refuse to help your sister? You know she's on the verge of losing everything." I took a deep breath. "Melanie, I already helped her. More than once. But this is not my responsibility," she scoffed. "You don't understand what it's like to raise kids to have mouths to feed. What is 50,000 to you if it means keeping family together?" I hung up before the tears could spill over. I knew I would not convince anyone who had already chosen their side. That evening, after a long day of trying to focus on work while messages poured in, I drove to my parents' house. I told myself I just wanted clarity to put everything on the table. Their porch light glowed warm against the fading sky as I walked up the steps, but the welcome I hoped for did not come. My father opened the door, his expression hard. "Clara," he said, stepping aside without warmth, "your mother and I have been waiting." Inside the house smelled of pot roast and lemon cleaner, but instead of comfort, it felt suffocating. My mother sat on the sofa, arms folded, lips pressed in a thin line. Rachel was perched in the recliner, her eyes puffy, tissues scattered around her. Ethan sat stiffly beside her, his gaze fixed on the carpet. "We need to settle this," my father said, motioning toward the dining table. "Sit down." I sat, my heart pounding. My mother leaned forward immediately, her voice sharp. "Clara, we cannot keep waiting. Rachel needs to book the venue this week. The florist, the photographer, everything depends on your decision." I gripped the edge of the table. "Mom, I have told you I cannot and will not give that kind of money." Rachel's sobs broke the air. "You are going to ruin my wedding, Clara. Do you know how humiliating this island, my children will never forgive you?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but still said nothing. His silence made me angrier than her tears. My father's voice grew cold. "We raised you better than this. A family member in need is never turned away. If you continue down this path, you will have no place here." I looked at him, at the man who had once lectured me about responsibility and keeping my promises. "You talk about responsibility," I said, my voice trembling, "but where was Rachel's responsibility when she borrowed $30,000 from me and never paid it back?" Rachel gasped as if I had struck her. "That was different. That was an investment in a business." "An investment?" I repeated, staring at her. "Businesses have contracts, Rachel, and you signed one." My mother's hand flew to her chest. "Clara, how could you bring that up now? That is between sisters." "No," I said firmly. "It is not just between sisters. It is the truth." The room went silent except for Rachel's muffled sobs. My father's face flushed with anger, his jaw clenched tight. "You are heartless, Clara. Money has poisoned you." I stood slowly, pushing the chair back with a screech against the floor. If protecting the future I worked for makes me heartless, then so be it. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but they were not for me. She turned to Rachel, smoothing her hair, whispering that everything would be fine. I watched them, my chest heavy, realizing that no matter what evidence I had, they would never see me as the daughter who sacrificed, only the daughter who refused. I picked up my bag from the corner of the room and slung it over my shoulder. My father's voice followed me to the door. "Think carefully, Clara. If you walk out without agreeing, you may never walk back in." The knob felt cold in my hand. I stepped outside into the night air, the door clicking shut behind me, and for the first time I felt the full weight of what standing my ground might cost. The next few days passed in a blur of work and restless nights. I tried burying myself in tax returns and client calls, but every time my phone buzzed, I felt my stomach twist. Most of the messages I ignored, though. A few slipped through carrying the same demand dressed in different words. "Pay for the wedding. Save the family. Do your duty." On Friday evening, I stopped by a coffee shop near my office to clear my head. The bell over the door chimed, and I looked up to see Marcus, Ethan's older brother, stepping inside. He spotted me and walked over with a hesitant smile. I had met him twice before at family gatherings, but we had never had more than a polite conversation. "Clara," he said, "do you mind if I join you?" I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Please." He sat, wrapping his hands around his cup of black coffee. "I heard what happened at your parents' place," he said quietly. "Rachel has been spreading the story around like wildfire." I let out a bitter laugh. "Of course she has." Marcus studied me for a moment. "I know this is none of my business, but I thought you should know something about Ethan." My chest tightened. "Go on." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "Ethan hasn't had steady work in almost 2 years. He tells people he's consulting, but the truth is he's been living off credit cards and what Rachel can squeeze out of family." I sat back in my chair, my throat dry. I suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made my heart pound. There's more, Marcus continued. I don't know the full details, but I think he has some debts. Gambling debts. He spends a lot of time at that casino outside of Salem. He thinks nobody knows, but I've covered for him a few times when people came asking. The words landed heavy like a weight pressing on my chest. I gripped my coffee cup, my fingers trembling. So the money for the wedding might not even go to the wedding. Marcus nodded grimly. I wish I could tell you otherwise, but I've seen this pattern before. He gets in over his head, Rachel defends him, and somehow they find a way to make someone else pick up the tab. Anger surged through me, mingled with a sick sense of relief. At least now I knew why Ethan had sat in silence while Rachel cried and demanded. He was hoping I would bail them both out. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Because you deserve to know the truth, Marcus said. I can't stand by and watch him drag you down too. I pressed my hands together, trying to steady my thoughts. Thank you, Marcus. I mean it. He gave a small nod, then looked toward the door. Just be careful. They won't stop pushing. That night, lying in bed, I replayed his words again and again. Ethan unemployed. Ethan gambling. Rachel covering for him. My parents blind to it all. Every piece fit together too neatly to ignore. On Sunday, my parents invited me back for dinner. I went more out of duty than desire, determined to keep my composure. The table was set with roast chicken and mashed potatoes, the same comfort food my mother always made when she wanted to soften bad news. As we ate, my father cleared his throat. Clara, have you had time to reconsider? I set down my fork. I cannot pay for the wedding. Rachel's eyes filled instantly with tears. Her children deserve a day to remember. Ethan and I just want to start our marriage right. Ethan shifted in his seat, staring at his plate. I looked directly at him. Maybe you should tell them about your work situation, Ethan. His fork froze midair. Rachel's head whipped toward me. Don't start, Clara. My father frowned. What do you mean? I leaned back, my heart pounding. Marcus told me Ethan hasn't had steady employment in 2 years, that he spends more time at the casino than at any office. The room erupted. Rachel slammed her hand on the table. You have no right to drag Marcus into this. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Ethan's face had gone pale and his hands shook as he set down his fork. My father looked from me to Ethan, his eyes narrowing. Is this true? Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. My mother gasped, clutching her chest, while Rachel jumped in, her voice shrill. This is all lies. She's making it up to get out of helping. I felt my pulse in my throat, but I kept my voice steady. I will not fund a wedding when I know the money might end up in a casino. My father's face flushed with fury. Enough. This conversation is over. I pushed back my chair, my legs shaking but my head high. I had said what needed to be said, and the truth once spoken could not be shoved back into the shadows. The following week my father called and demanded I come over again. His tone was clipped, not a request, but a summons. I told myself I was done playing along, but a part of me still hoped he would finally listen. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my chest felt tight. Inside the living room, my parents sat on the couch with Rachel and Ethan. Rachel's children, Tyler and Emma, were there, too, curled up on the armchair. Their wide eyes flicked to me the second I walked in, as if they already knew what was about to happen. My father wasted no time. Clara, this foolishness has gone on long enough. Your sister is drowning and you stand by with your arms folded. I kept my coat on, clutching the sleeves to stop my hands from shaking. Dad, I have given more than you know. You refuse to see it. My mother leaned forward, her voice sharp through her tears. Clara, how dare you sit there and act like the victim? Your sister is about to lose everything and you sit in judgment. Rachel sniffled loudly, tugging both children closer to her side. Look at them, Clara. Do you really want Tyler and Emma to remember their childhood as the time their aunt turned her back? Tyler's face crumpled, and Emma's lip trembled as she whispered, Mommy, are we really going to lose our home? My heart cracked, but I forced myself to stand firm. Rachel's arms tightened around them, her voice rising with just enough drama to fill the room. All I ever wanted was to give my children a safe and happy life. If you cared, Clara, you would not make them suffer for your selfishness. Ethan stared down at the floor, motionless like a man bracing for a storm. I caught a flash of guilt on his face, but he said nothing. I turned to my father. Do you ever ask why Rachel and Ethan are in this situation? Why is it always my responsibility to fix their choices? He slammed his hand against the arm of the couch. Because you can. Because you are lucky enough to have the means, and refusing is nothing but cruelty. Lucky. The word seared through me like acid. Lucky was what they called my 16-hour days in college. My sleepless nights during tax season, the sacrifices I had made. Rachel's tears dried instantly, anger flashing in her eyes. Admit it, Clara. You think you are better than me. You always have. You look down on me because I chose to be a mother instead of chasing money. My mother nodded as if that settled it. Rachel gave us grandchildren. Rachel includes us in her life. You only show up when it suits you. I wanted to shout that I had been the one who paid when Rachel's boutique failed, that I had carried her through debts she pretended did not exist. But the children's frightened faces stopped me. They were being used as shields, and I could see how easily the story had been twisted. I straightened my shoulders. I will not give you $50,000. Not now, not ever, Rachel gasped, as if I had struck her. You are choosing money over family. No, I said, my voice low but steady. I am choosing boundaries. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the sound of Emma's small sniffle. My father's jaw was tight, his face red. My mother's tears turned to fury. Rachel clung to her children, rocking them like a woman wronged by the world. I took a step toward the door. I will not keep standing here being painted as the villain. Rachel's voice rose shrill and desperate. Fine, Clara. Walk away. But remember, you will have no sister after this. My children will have no aunt. Tyler twisted in her arms, his small voice breaking. But I love Aunt Clara. Rachel shushed him quickly, pressing his head into her shoulder. The words sliced through me, but I forced myself to keep moving. At that moment, standing in that living room full of accusations and tears, I knew nothing I said would change their story. I opened the door, the cold evening air rushing in. Behind me, my father called after me, his voice low and final. If you leave now, you are finished with this family. I stepped outside, my heart pounding, and pulled the door shut before I could change my mind. The porch light cast a sharp glow on the driveway, and I stood there for a long moment trying to catch my breath, knowing the next time I walked back into that house, it would not be as their scapegoat anymore. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a heaviness in my chest that no amount of coffee could shake off. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the brown envelope, the same one I had pulled out so many times before. The edges were soft from handling, but inside it was still sharp, still powerful, still waiting for the moment when I needed it. By afternoon, I knew I could not wait any longer. I drove back to my parents' house, my heart thumping like a drum the entire way. The house looked the same as always, neat hedges, freshly swept porch, the flag fluttering in the yard. But to me, it felt like enemy territory. When I stepped inside, the whole family was already gathered. My parents sat stiffly on the couch. Rachel was at the recliner with Ethan beside her, his hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. The children were in the corner with coloring books, but kept sneaking anxious glances at the adults. I stood in the center of the room, my purse on my shoulder. They all turned to me as if I had walked in carrying fire. My father was the first to speak. Clara, unless you have come to make things right, you might as well leave. My hand slipped into my purse, and I pulled out the envelope. I held it up for everyone to see. I have something we need to talk about. Rachel's eyes went wide. What is that? I walked to the dining table, placed the envelope flat, and slid the papers out. The notary seal gleamed under the chandelier light. This, I said, is the loan agreement you signed in March 2020 when I gave you $30,000 for your jewelry boutique. Gasps filled the room. My mother's face went pale, my father leaned forward, and Ethan froze in place. Rachel jumped up, her face blotchy. That was just a formality. You never expected me to pay it back. I shook my head slowly. I absolutely expected you to pay it back. 24 monthly installments with 5% interest. That is what you signed. She shook her head furiously. No, no, you tricked me. My father stood and snatched the papers from the table, scanning them quickly. His face darkened. This is notarized. Of course it is, I said. I learned from you, Dad. You always told me to put everything in writing. My mother's lips trembled. Rachel, is this true? Did you borrow this money? Rachel's tears came hot and fast, her voice rising. I did it for the family, for the kids. I just wanted to build something. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Marcus, who had just walked in the doorway. I had not expected him, but his timing was uncanny. He looked at the papers, then at his brother. Marcus spoke calmly, his voice cutting through Rachel's wails. She is not lying about borrowing the money, but she is lying about why it never got paid back. Rachel spun on him, her voice sharp. Stop it. Marcus didn't stop. Ethan used part of that money to cover his gambling debts. The room exploded. My father dropped the papers on the table as if they burned his hands. My mother gasped and covered her mouth. Rachel screamed at Marcus, calling him a liar. Ethan finally spoke, his voice hollow. She is right. I was in trouble. I thought I could win it back. I thought no one would know. Rachel lunged at him. How could you admit that? I stood frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. The truth was spilling out faster than I could have hoped. My father pointed a trembling finger at Rachel. You let us sit here and accuse Clara while all this time you knew. Rachel's sobs filled the air. I was trying to protect my family. I was trying to protect Ethan. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the envelope, my voice steady despite the chaos. No more pretending. I helped once, and instead of being honest, you lied. Instead of repaying, you took more. The children looked frightened now, Tyler clutching Emma's hand. I felt a pang in my chest, but I did not back down. Ethan collapsed back into the recliner, rubbing his face with both hands. Rachel stood shaking, fury radiating from her. My parents sat silent, finally realizing the daughter they had defended so fiercely had been hiding far more than they wanted to see. I placed the envelope back in my purse and looked around the room. This is the truth. Whether you choose to accept it or not is up to you. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen and the crinkle of Tyler's coloring book page as Emma turned it nervously. I stepped toward the door, the envelope pressed against my side, knowing the next word out of my mouth would change everything. My father was the first to recover his voice, though it came out rough and uncertain. Is this true, Ethan? Are you gambling away the money your wife borrows from family? Ethan's face was ashen, his eyes sunk deep in shame. I tried to stop, he muttered. I thought I could turn it around, win enough to cover what I owed. I thought no one would find out. Rachel's fury flared hot and wild. You idiot, she screamed. Do you see what you've done? Now everyone knows. I stood steady, my hands clasped tight in front of me, watching the cracks split wider through the picture-perfect image Rachel had always tried to protect. Marcus stepped closer, his tone flat and cold. I warned you, Ethan. I told you it would come out. You should have told them yourself. Rachel spun on him. This is your fault. You never liked Ethan. You've always wanted to ruin things for us. Ethan's head snapped up, his voice sharp. Enough, Rachel. Don't pin this on Marcus. This is on me. My father's hands shook as he picked the papers back up from the table, gripping them like they were the last thread holding him together. $30,000, he whispered, and not a cent paid back. My mother's tears ran freely now. She looked at me, her face twisted in pain. Clara, why didn't you tell us? Because you wouldn't have believed me, I answered quietly. You never do when it comes to Rachel. The silence was heavy and cutting. Rachel's chest heaved with every breath, her children huddled together on the chair, their eyes wide and terrified. I turned to Rachel. Do you understand now why I will not pay for your wedding? Do you see why I cannot hand you $50,000 to vanish into a black hole of lies and debts? Her face contorted with rage. You are cruel. You have always been cruel. I shook my head. No, Rachel, I have been patient. I have been generous. And I have been used. Ethan slammed his palm against the arm of the recliner, startling everyone. Fine, he shouted. You want the truth. If we don't find a way to pay the men I owe, we'll come looking for me. For us. The room froze. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls as if they might keep the danger at bay. My father's face drained of all color. What men? My father demanded, his voice hoarse. Ethan buried his face in his hands. You don't want to know. I felt the anger rise so fast it almost choked me. So this is the wedding fund. Not flowers. Not photographers. A payoff to keep collectors from your door. Rachel screamed at him, her voice shrill. You promised me this wouldn't touch the family. It already has, I said. You've dragged all of us into it. Marcus's voice cut through the chaos, calm but sharp. He owes more than just money. He owes favors, and that is worse. Rachel collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing. My father staggered to the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a drink with shaking hands. My mother whispered prayers under her breath, her rosary beads slipping through her fingers. The room had turned into a theater of panic and fear, but I felt an odd calm settle over me. The truth was no longer hidden. It was out in the open, ugly and undeniable. I looked at my father, his drink trembling in his hand. Do you still want to tell me that refusing to pay makes me no daughter of yours? His eyes met mine, bloodshot and wavering. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Rachel lunged forward, suddenly grabbing the contract from the table and crumpling it in her fist. You won't ruin me with this, she screamed. I stepped toward her, my voice steady and low. That contract is not what will ruin you, Rachel. The truth already has. Ethan leaned back in his chair, defeated, staring at the ceiling, as if waiting for it to collapse. The children clung tighter to each other, confusion written all over their young faces. The envelope was back in my purse, safe, unbending. I knew this was far from over. The lies had been cracked open, but what lay beneath them was darker than even I had imagined. The night after Ethan's confession, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in my apartment and the faint buzz of traffic outside. My mind replayed every word, every accusation, every sob that had filled my parents' living room. By dawn, I knew they would not let it rest. Sure enough, late that afternoon, I got a call from my father. His voice was tight, almost brittle. Clara, come to the house. We need to talk. When I arrived, the tension was thick enough to choke on. My parents sat at the dining table, shoulders hunched, faces drawn. Rachel stood at the end of the room with Ethan beside her, eyes swollen from crying. Even Aunt Marlene was there, perched on a chair, arms crossed like she was ready to witness a trial. My mother's voice trembled as she spoke. Clara, we cannot let this family fall apart. You have the means to help. If you give them the money, Ethan can settle his mistakes quietly. The wedding can go on, and no one outside the family will ever have to know. I felt my body stiffen. So that's what this was now, not just about a wedding, but about covering Ethan's tracks. My father slammed his palm on the table, his voice booming. Do you not understand the shame this will bring if people find out? The church, the neighbors, our friends. Do you want this family dragged through the mud? My jaw clenched. The shame comes from the lies, not from my refusal. Rachel's voice rose shrill and desperate. Stop pretending you care about this family. You just want to punish me. You always have. I forced myself to stay calm, though the fury inside me burned hot. I turned to my father. You once taught me that integrity matters more than appearance. That truth matters more than comfort. Yet here you are asking me to fund a lie. His face darkened. If you walk away from this, Clara, you will be erased from this family. You will be written out of the will, out of everything. A sharp voice cut in from the corner. It was Mrs. Wilson, my parents' longtime neighbor, who had been invited for dinner and apparently caught more of the argument than intended. She leaned forward, her gray eyes sharp. I have known Clara since she was a girl. I have seen her work for everything she has, and I have seen Rachel waste every chance she was given. If you disown the only responsible one here, you will regret it. The room froze. My mother looked horrified that the words had been spoken aloud. My father's mouth snapped shut, and Rachel's face twisted with rage. Rachel spat the words like venom. Stay out of this. You don't know what you are talking about. Mrs. Wilson's gaze never wavered. I know enough. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his voice low and strained. She's right. Clara is not the enemy here. I am. Rachel whipped around to glare at him. Don't you dare take her side. But Ethan didn't meet her eyes. He just stared at the table as if all his fight had drained away. I took a slow breath and spoke clearly, my voice steady. I will not give you $50,000. I will not sacrifice my future to patch holes in a sinking ship. My mother began to cry openly, my father's fists clenched at his sides, and Rachel's sobs rose again, loud and theatrical. But for the first time, there was another voice in the room besides mine. Mrs. Wilson sat tall, her presence like a shield. I gathered my things and stood, the envelope with the contract pressed against my side inside my bag. I could feel its weight like armor, a reminder that I had proof, that I had truth, even if no one else wanted to face it. My father's voice followed me as I walked toward the door, low and sharp. This is your last chance, Clara. Either you choose this family, or you walk away from it forever. I paused at the threshold, the cool night air spilling in through the open door, and for a moment I thought of all the years I had spent bending to their will. Then I stepped outside without a word, letting the door close behind me with a heavy finality that echoed in my chest. The next morning, my phone lit up with messages before the sun had even cleared the horizon. Some were from my parents, long paragraphs full of guilt and fury. Others from cousins I barely spoke to, all echoing the same chorus of how selfish I was and how much pain I had caused Rachel. I scrolled through them slowly, each word cutting but not surprising. What struck me most was the silence from Ethan. By mid-afternoon, the silence broke when he showed up at my apartment building. I spotted him from the window, standing awkwardly near the entrance, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He looked thinner, older, his tie loose and jacket wrinkled as if he had not slept. Against my better judgment, I went downstairs. He didn't meet my eyes when I stepped outside. Clara, I need to talk, please. I folded my arms. Make it quick. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking like a boy caught stealing cookies. Rachel is spiraling. She's blaming me for everything, saying I ruined her life, that I set her up. She keeps telling anyone who will listen that you manipulated me into confessing. I almost laughed. Manipulated you? Stood in front of 50 people and admitted what you did. His shoulders sagged. I know. And I meant it. But she's furious. She's threatening to take the kids and disappear. For a moment, I saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of losing money or reputation, but the fear of losing his children. You married her, I said quietly. You knew who she was. I thought I could fix it. He sounded broken. I thought if I worked harder, kept her happy, maybe she would stop. But it just kept getting worse. The weight of his words sank in. I realized that despite everything, Ethan wasn't just a co-conspirator in Rachel's chaos, he was also trapped in it. What do you want from me? I asked. He looked up finally. I want to make it right. I want to tell the truth, all of it, not just the gambling, not just the failed businesses. Everything. I studied him, unsure if I could believe it. And why come to me? Because you are the only one who has ever held her accountable. He swallowed hard. And because I know you still have that contract. The mention of the contract made my chest tighten. It was my safety net, my evidence. I kept it locked away in a fireproof box, a reminder that Rachel's lies were not just stories but debts. I don't know if I can trust you, I admitted. You don't have to trust me. Just hear me out. Against my instincts, I nodded. We walked to the small coffee shop around the corner. It was quiet, just a few college students typing on laptops and an elderly couple sharing pie. We sat in the back. Ethan took a deep breath. Rachel opened credit cards in your mom's name, 3 of them. She maxed them out in less than 6 months. Your mom doesn't even know yet. The words slammed into me. I felt the blood drain from my face. Are you serious? Dead serious. He leaned closer. And there's more. She's been dipping into your dad's retirement account. Small withdrawals but steady. He hasn't noticed. I pressed my hand against my mouth, trying to process it. My parents had accused me of being greedy, of hoarding money, while Rachel was stealing from them under their roof. Why are you telling me this now? Because I can't carry it anymore. I'm filing for divorce. Clara. I'm done covering for her. The admission hung in the air like a confession at church. I watched him crumble his hands, shaking his coffee untouched. Do you have proof? I asked finally. He nodded. Statements, emails, even texts where she bragged about it. I kept copies. Something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. This was about exposing the truth that had been buried under years of lies and manipulation. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. If you're serious, Ethan, this is going to get ugly. It already is, he whispered. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the contract spread out in front of me. The notary's seal gleamed under the lamplight. I thought of Rachel screaming at me, my parents disowning me, the guests whispering about my supposed cruelty. I thought of the children, Tyler and Emma, caught in the middle of chaos they never asked for. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Rebecca, my old college friend and now attorney. She had been at the party, she had seen it all. Do you still want me to move forward with what we discussed, she wrote. I stared at the words. Forward meant legal action. Forward meant no turning back. I typed back slowly. Not yet, but soon. I closed the contract and slid it back into the box. The weight of it was both burden and protection. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow, I would decide how far I was willing to go. For the first time in weeks, I slept deeply, but my dreams were filled with echoes of my father's voice telling me I was no daughter of his, and Rachel's face twisting in rage when the truth began to surface. I woke up the next morning with a calm I hadn't felt in months. The box with the contract sat on my dresser, quiet and steady, as if it was waiting for me to decide its fate. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out at the park across the street. Children were chasing each other through the grass, their laughter floating up to my window. For the first time, I let myself think of Rachel's kids, Tyler and Emma, and how none of this was their fault. By noon, I was in Rebecca's office. She spread the documents across her polished desk, neat rows of papers with my notes and Ethan's evidence stacked beside them. Her dark eyes met mine. Clara, once we file, it will be public record. There's no undoing it. I nodded. I've lived my whole life cleaning up their messes. It ends today. Rebecca gave a small smile. Then, let's give them the truth. The days that followed felt like watching a slow storm roll in. Ethan filed for divorce, attaching the credit card fraud, the gambling debts, and the stolen retirement withdrawals as evidence. Rebecca sent formal letters to my parents detailing the promissory note Rachel had signed and the outstanding balance. The tone was sharp, professional, impossible to twist into gossip. The calls came first. My mother begging in a trembling voice. Clara, don't do this. Think of your sister. Then my father, angrier, his words clipped. You're destroying us. Finally, Rachel herself screaming into the phone until I hung up. I didn't answer after that. 2 weeks later, the truth reached the community. Not from me, but from the courthouse filings. It didn't take long for neighbors, church friends, and even distant relatives to put the pieces together. My parents' perfect image cracked. The whispers they had once used to shame me now turned on them. At the grocery store, Mrs. Wilson stopped me by the produce section. Her hand was warm on mine. You did the right thing, Clara. Sometimes truth takes time to settle, but it always does. Her words carried me through the next month as the fallout unfolded. Rachel moved out of Ethan's house, forced into a small apartment she could barely afford. Ethan gained primary custody of the kids. Tyler and Emma started spending weekends with me, their laughter filling the empty corners of my apartment. The first night they stayed over, Emma drew a picture of the three of us at my kitchen table. She taped it to my fridge with a proud smile. My parents grew quieter. The sharp accusations dwindled into short messages, then silence. I heard through Rebecca that they had to refinance their home to cover the debts Rachel left behind. My father still refused to look at me in public, but my mother sent a Christmas card with nothing inside except her name in shaky handwriting. On a cool March evening 6 months after the night they threatened to disown me, I stood on the balcony of my new condo. The city lights glittered in the distance, and for the first time I felt like I was living a life that belonged to me. No strings, no obligations, no hidden debts. Rebecca joined me with 2 glasses of wine. She raised hers, her smile steady. To boundaries, she said. I clinked my glass against hers. To finally learning that family isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who respects your worth. I thought of every woman who had ever been told she was selfish for saying no, every daughter accused of being ungrateful because she refused to be the family's ATM. I thought of how many of us carried that weight in silence. So if you're listening and you face the same kind of manipulation, know this. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. Refusing to be drained dry is not selfish. Family who love you won't threaten to erase you for standing your ground. Tell me in the comments what boundaries you've had to set with your own family. I read every single one because this community right here is my chosen family too. And if this story spoke to you, give it a like and subscribe so we can keep sharing these truths together. Until next time, stay strong.